In the spring of 1581, as cherry blossoms fell like snow across Kyoto, a man unlike any other strode through the imperial capital of Japan. His ebony skin gleamed in stark contrast to the sea of pale faces that parted before him, his towering frame dwarfing even the tallest samurai of Oda Nobunaga's elite guard. Yasuke, the African warrior who crossed oceans and cultures to become history's most unlikely samurai, carried 2 swords at his hip and the weight of impossible circumstances on his shoulders. His journey from enslaved man to honored warrior in the inner circle of Japan's most powerful warlord defies all conventional narratives of the 16th century world, a testament to the unpredictable alchemy that occurs when extraordinary human potential meets the chaos of historical opportunity. The story of Yasuke begins not in the ordered gardens of Kyoto, but in the sun-baked villages of East Africa, likely in the territories of what is now Mozambique. In the 1550s, Portuguese influence snaked along the African coastline like tendrils of a hungry vine, their merchants and missionaries penetrating ever deeper into lands Europeans had barely mapped. They came seeking souls for Christ and bodies for labor. Among the countless unnamed children torn from their homes during these raids was a boy whose exceptional physical strength would one day become legendary in a land he could not yet imagine. By the time Alessandro Valignano, the ambitious Italian Jesuit appointed as visitor of missions in the Indies, acquired the young African as a body servant in 1578, the man now called Yasuke had already survived trials that would have broken most spirits. Towering well over 6 feet, a giant even by modern standards and practically mythological, in an age when the average Japanese man stood barely 5 feet tall, Yasuke had learned the bitter arts of survival. Valignano, shrewd judge of both men and opportunities, recognized something extraordinary in his servant's dignified bearing and quick intelligence. When the Jesuit prepared for his inspection tour of mission outposts across Asia, he selected Yasuke to accompany him on the arduous journey that would ultimately deliver them both to Japan's volcanic shores and into the pages of history. The voyage across the Indian Ocean was fraught with the perils that defined 16th century maritime travel. Portuguese caravels, technological marvels of their day, battled typhoons that could splinter wood like kindling, and pirates who showed no mercy to the captured. Below decks, where Yasuke likely spent much of the journey, the air hung thick with the stench of unwashed bodies and rotting provisions. Yet even in these grim conditions, he observed and absorbed. From the multilingual sailors, he picked up fragments of Portuguese, perhaps some Spanish and Chinese. From the Jesuit missionaries who saw potential converts in every port, he gleaned something of European manners and Christian doctrine, though evidence suggests he never embraced the faith himself. When Valignano's party anchored in the sheltered harbor of Nagasaki in July 1579, they stepped into a Japan balanced on the knife edge of the transformation. For nearly a century, the island nation had been consumed by the Sengoku Jidai, the Warring States period, where daimyo warlords carved Japan into bloody fiefdoms. But now Oda Nobunaga, a military genius of ruthless vision, was methodically unifying these fragments through a combination of battlefield brilliance and political cunning. His innovations in warfare, deploying arquebus firearms that rendered traditional samurai tactics obsolete and building castle fortifications that reshaped military architecture, were revolutionizing Japan. As Yasuke took his first steps onto Japanese soil, neither he nor anyone else could have predicted how dramatically his fate would soon intertwine with Nobunaga's bold ambitions. Nagasaki in 1579 existed as a peculiar bubble of Western influence in an otherwise closed Japan. Founded barely 30 years earlier, the port had transformed from fishing village to trading hub under the influence of Portuguese merchants and Jesuit missionaries who had negotiated the exclusive right to European commerce. Here, crucifixes stood alongside torii gates, and the sounds of Latin Mass mingled with Shinto chants. Into this cultural crossroads, Valignano's party brought their most visually striking asset, Yasuke. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Japanese chronicles record that locals broke down doors and climbed walls just to glimpse the dark-skinned foreigner. During one particularly chaotic episode, the crush of the crowd became so dangerous that several people were trampled. Valignano, ever the strategist, quickly recognized Yasuke's value as more than servant. He was a living attraction that could open doors to noble houses, including potentially that of the great unifier, Nobunaga himself. The Jesuits' journey inland toward Kyoto traversed a Japan scarred by decades of civil war. Village after village stood abandoned or burned, rice fields lay fallow, and armed bands patrolled provincial borders. For Yasuke, whose own homeland had been ravaged by slave raids and tribal conflicts, the sight must have struck familiar chords of human suffering. Yet Japan's devastation was paradoxically more organized, systematic destruction in service to daimyo ambitions rather than the chaotic predation he had known in Africa. As the Jesuit party crossed into territories controlled by Nobunaga, they witnessed the beginnings of his new order rising from the ashes of war. Roads cleared, of bandits allowed commerce to flow again. Farmers returned to fields under the protection of centralized authority. Castle towns bustled with craftsmen and merchants serving samurai households. Nobunaga, for all his ruthlessness on the battlefield, was creating the infrastructure of peace through overwhelming force, a contradiction that defined the age. Valignano's embassy finally reached Kyoto in February 1581, arriving at a capital transformed by Nobunaga's vision. Where once rival samurai families had turned city streets into battlegrounds, now engineers and architects reshaped the urban landscape according to geometric principles. The ancient imperial seat was becoming something new, a centralized capital for a unified Japan. As Yasuke walked these ordered streets, he could not have known that within weeks, his life would become inextricably linked to the architect of this transformation, a warlord whose curiosity about the outside world matched his appetite for conquest, and who would soon become fascinated by the black warrior from a distant shore. The news of Yasuke's arrival in Kyoto spread through the city like wildfire. Contemporary Japanese accounts describe crowds so large they blocked entire streets, with people offering money just for a glimpse of the black samurai. Merchants abandoned their stalls, craftsmen set aside their tools, and nobles dispatched servants to verify the rumors. For a society that had deliberately isolated itself from the outside world for generations, Yasuke represented not just novelty, but an entirely new category of human existence. Neither Japanese nor Chinese, neither Korean, nor even the occasional fair-skinned Portuguese trader they had encountered. The Japanese chronicles of 1581 record the public's initial reaction with unvarnished frankness. Many believed his skin was painted or dyed, and officials ordered him to strip to the waist and scrub his skin, while witnesses marveled that the color remained unchanged. Others suspected he might be a demon or spirit, perhaps one of the legendary Oni from Japanese folklore, come to life. For his part, Yasuke maintained a warrior's dignity through this dehumanizing spectacle, perhaps drawing on the stoic resilience that had carried him from slavery to this improbable moment, halfway around the world. Word of this extraordinary visitor inevitably reached Nobunaga at his imposing Azuchi Castle, a revolutionary fortress that rose 7 stories above Lake Biwa. The warlord, known for his intellectual curiosity and rejection of tradition when it suited him, immediately commanded Valignano to present Yasuke at court. On March 23, 1581, Yasuke stood before the man who had slaughtered tens of thousands in his campaign to unify Japan. What Nobunaga saw clearly impressed him. Not merely an exotic curiosity, but a man of immense physical power and dignified bearing. The Japanese leader, himself a military innovator who had upended samurai combat traditions with modern firearms, recognized in Yasuke something he valued above all else: useful potential. The meeting transformed Yasuke's status overnight. Nobunaga awarded him a sum of money, and more significantly, removed him from Valignano's service. The Jesuit, while reluctant to lose such a valuable asset, could hardly refuse the man who controlled access to Japan's power structure. For Yasuke, this moment marked a pivotal transition, from object of curiosity to a man with agency and identity in this foreign land. Nobunaga, who had built his empire on recognizing talent, regardless of origin, had seen something in the African warrior that transcended the color of his skin. What began as a spectacle was becoming something far more consequential. A historical impossibility taking its first steps toward reality. Oda Nobunaga's Azuchi Castle stood as Japan's most formidable architectural marvel, a seven-tiered fusion of military pragmatism and aesthetic ambition rising above Lake Biwa. Unlike traditional fortresses designed solely for defense, this revolutionary structure symbolized Nobunaga's vision for a transformed Japan. Impressive, yet functional; traditional, yet innovative. Inside these walls, Yasuke found himself not merely an object of curiosity, but a subject of intense study by one of history's most astute judges of human capability. Nobunaga's initial fascination with Yasuke went beyond mere novelty. Contemporary accounts in the Shinchokoki, the official chronicle of Nobunaga's exploits, record the warlord's specific interest in Yasuke's physical strength. He ordered demonstrations that confirmed what the African's powerful build suggested. Here was a warrior whose raw power exceeded even the elite samurai of Nobunaga's personal guard. One account describes Yasuke effortlessly lifting weights that required two strong Japanese men working together, a feat that visibly impressed the warlord, who had built his empire on recognizing and deploying exceptional talent. Language proved an unexpected bridge between the unlikely pair. Yasuke had absorbed Portuguese from his time with Valignano, and Nobunaga, unlike many Japanese nobles who disdained foreign, barbarian tongues, had learned some Portuguese from previous European visitors. Their early conversations, likely a halting mixture of Japanese and Portuguese, revealed something that impressed Nobunaga far more than Yasuke's strength: his intelligence and adaptability. In a society where foreigners were expected to remain perpetual outsiders, Yasuke's rapid acquisition of Japanese customs and language challenged entrenched assumptions. What followed defied the rigid social hierarchy of feudal Japan. Within weeks, Nobunaga elevated Yasuke from curiosity to companion, granting him privileges normally reserved for trusted samurai. He assigned Yasuke quarters within the castle itself, rather than the outer compounds where foreigners were typically housed. More significantly, he began including him in inner circle gatherings where strategy and governance were discussed, sessions normally limited to hereditary vassals whose families had served the Oda clan for generations. For those traditional samurai, this African interloper's unprecedented access to their lord sparked both resentment and bewilderment. By summer 1581, Yasuke's transition accelerated dramatically when Nobunaga took a step that shocked the Japanese court. He bestowed upon Yasuke the status of hatamoto, a samurai in direct service to the lord himself, complete with a ceremonial sword. For a foreign-born man, let alone one of African origin, to receive such recognition violated every social convention of status-obsessed feudal Japan. Yet Nobunaga, who had already upended Japanese warfare by embracing firearms over traditional archery and cavalry, seemed to delight in this further disruption of established order. In Yasuke, the great unifier had found not just an impressive warrior, but a walking embodiment of his willingness to discard tradition when talent demanded recognition. The eagle's eye had spotted something exceptional, and now the world would bear witness to its consequences. The transformation of Yasuke from foreign curiosity to samurai warrior unfolded with unprecedented speed. By autumn 1581, Nobunaga had assigned him the ultimate measure of trust, a place among his personal bodyguards. For a man born on African soil to stand sword-ready behind Japan's most powerful warlord marked not merely an individual's remarkable journey, but a fissure in the rigid social architecture of feudal Japan. Each morning, Yasuke donned the distinctive armor of Nobunaga's elite guard, the lacquered plates and helmet presenting a striking contrast against his dark skin, a visual embodiment of his liminal status, neither fully Japanese nor merely foreign, but something history had never before categorized. The practical education of a samurai encompassed far more than swordsmanship. Yasuke immersed himself in the complex choreography of Japanese court etiquette, the precise angles of bowing, the layered meanings of formal address, the subtle signals conveyed through posture and eye contact. He studied kyujutsu archery alongside the traditional arts of tantojutsu, knife fighting, and bajutsu, horsemanship. Most challenging was mastering the philosophical underpinnings of Bushido, the way of the warrior, which demanded not merely physical courage, but spiritual discipline and absolute loyalty. For Yasuke, whose life had been defined by forced adaptation, this latest metamorphosis represented something revolutionary, a transformation undertaken by choice, in service to a master he had willingly accepted. Contemporary accounts suggest his commitment to this new identity was total. The Portuguese Jesuit Luís Freire, who visited Nobunaga's court during this period, wrote with evident surprise of seeing the African who speaks Japanese as if born here, moving confidently among samurai, who now addressed him with respectful honorifics rather than as a curiosity. In a society where insider and outsider status determined every aspect of existence, Yasuke had achieved what no foreigner before him had managed: acceptance within the innermost circles of Japanese power. The first time Yasuke's steel tasted blood in Nobunaga's service came during a skirmish against remnant forces loyal to the Takeda clan in early 1582. The battle, a minor footnote in Japan's sprawling civil wars, became legendary among Nobunaga's men for what transpired on its edges. As chronicled in surviving accounts, a contingent of Takeda samurai spotted the African warrior and, mistaking his distinctive appearance for a tactical vulnerability, concentrated their attack on him. Their fatal miscalculation became apparent as Yasuke unveiled a fighting style Japan had never witnessed, a fusion of African combat techniques acquired in his youth with the disciplined swordsmanship of his samurai training. Unlike traditional samurai who followed prescribed forms honed over centuries, Yasuke fought with devastating unpredictability. Where Japanese warriors maintained measured distance to execute perfect cuts, he closed gaps with explosive power. When convention dictated defensive postures, he attacked with calculated aggression. The Portuguese missionary João Rodrigues, who later documented this period, wrote of witnessing Yasuke fighting with the strength of 3 men and movements no Japanese swordmaster could anticipate. Most distinctive was his approach to the katana. Rather than employing only the traditional slashing techniques emphasized in Japanese swordsmanship, he incorporated powerful thrusting attacks more common to African spear fighting. This hybrid style bewildered opponents trained exclusively in Japanese martial arts, creating openings that Yasuke exploited with lethal efficiency. Nobunaga's calculated gamble on the African warrior paid its most significant dividend at the siege of Tenmokuzan Fortress in March 1582. Holding the critical right flank of Nobunaga's front line, Yasuke's unit found themselves confronting a desperate counterattack by cornered Takeda forces. Contemporary records describe a pivotal moment when Japanese samurai under his command hesitated before the ferocity of the Takeda charge. Yasuke, recognizing the critical juncture, broke protocol by bellowing a battle cry in his native African tongue, a sound so foreign and terrifying to Japanese ears that it momentarily froze both friend and foe. In this suspended moment, he surged forward alone against the enemy line, demonstrating a physical courage that shamed his unit into following. The psychological impact of this black warrior charging fearlessly against overwhelming odds unraveled the Takeda formation more effectively than any conventional tactic. By day's end, Yasuke's reputation had transformed from curiosity to legend. In his personal war journal, Nobunaga recorded a rare commendation, noting that the African's value on the battlefield exceeds what his unusual appearance first promised. By spring 1582, Yasuke had ascended to the most privileged position a warrior could attain. He became Nobunaga's personal sword-bearer. This role, traditionally reserved for vassals of ancient lineage, placed him literally at the warlord's elbow during both public audiences and private councils. Court diaries from this period note the startling image they presented. The pale, aristocratic Nobunaga, resplendent in silk robes that only a daimyo could afford, shadowed constantly by the towering African in the black and gold armor of the elite guard. Their physical contrast embodied Nobunaga's revolutionary approach to power, tradition and innovation, standing side by side, the established order and its deliberate disruption. What unfolded between them behind closed doors has been pieced together from fragments in contemporaneous accounts. The Jesuit Louis Froid observed that Nobunaga conversed with the African as with no other foreigner, speaking directly rather than through interpreters, and often laughing at his responses. More significant than these verbal exchanges were their silent communications during strategic councils. Nobunaga developed a habit of watching Yasuke's face during discussions of military tactics, noting the subtle reactions of a man who had witnessed warfare across 3 continents. When debating whether to attack the forces of Mori Terumoto in early 1582, it was reportedly Yasuke's barely perceptible headshake that gave Nobunaga pause, a gesture that saved his forces from a carefully laid ambush, according to documents found decades later in Mori clan archives. This growing influence earned Yasuke powerful enemies among traditional vassals, particularly Akechi Mitsuhide, whose family had served the Oda clan for generations, yet found themselves increasingly marginalized as Nobunaga's trust in the African warrior deepened. Mitsuhide, a cultured and ambitious general, masked his resentment behind perfect court manners, but Yasuke, attuned to the subtle language of hierarchy and favor through bitter experience, recognized the dangerous calculations forming behind the general's courteous facade. When he attempted to warn Nobunaga of Mitsuhide's questionable loyalty, however, the warlord merely laughed, unable to imagine betrayal from a samurai bound by generations of family service. It was a rare moment when cultural blindness affected both men. Nobunaga too enmeshed in Japanese traditions of loyalty to see their potential subversion, and Yasuke not yet recognizing how profoundly Nobunaga's disruptive reign had strained those same traditions to breaking point. By late spring 1582, Nobunaga stood on the precipice of total victory in his decades-long campaign to unify Japan. Only 2 significant powers remained beyond his control: the Mori clan to the west and the Hojo to the east. With characteristic strategic brilliance, he devised a 2-pronged offensive, dispatching his most trusted general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, with a massive force to crush the Mori, while simultaneously preparing a personal campaign against the Hojo. For the first time, historical records explicitly mention Yasuke's role in these preparations, noting his appointment as commander of a special unit of 50 skilled warriors, tasked with serving as Nobunaga's vanguard in the Eastern Campaign. This military promotion elevated Yasuke beyond personal guard to battlefield leader, a position that would have been unthinkable for any foreigner in previous eras of Japanese history. The logistics chroniclers of Nobunaga's army recorded the African warrior's distinctive battle preparations, his insistence on longer spears for his unit, modifications to standard armor that emphasized mobility over tradition, and drilling techniques that incorporated formations rarely used in Japanese warfare. When questioned about these innovations by senior commanders, Yasuke reportedly explained that his approach combined elements witnessed in Portuguese colonial conflicts in India with traditional African battle tactics from his homeland, a fusion of military knowledge literally spanning the globe. Nobunaga, himself a military innovator who had revolutionized Japanese warfare through the widespread deployment of firearms, approved these experimental approaches with characteristic enthusiasm for anything that might provide tactical advantage. As May turned to June, the war machine Nobunaga had spent decades perfecting stood ready for its final conquests, with Yasuke now firmly embedded within its command structure rather than merely at its periphery. The stage seemed set for the final acts of unification. Yet in the shadows, Akechi Mitsuhide, the seemingly loyal general whose warnings Yasuke had sensed but could not prove, was meticulously laying plans that would shatter the trajectory of Japanese history and irrevocably alter the fate of the African samurai who had risen so far from his enslaved origins. Dawn broke thin and gray over Kyoto on June 21st, 1582, a date that would forever alter Japan's destiny. Nobunaga, accompanied by a minimal guard, including Yasuke, had stopped at Honnō-ji Temple while traveling toward the Eastern Campaign. With most of his army dispatched under Hideyoshi against the Mori, the warlord who had nearly unified Japan rested with barely 100 men protecting him. The reduced security reflected not carelessness but confidence. After all, his troops controlled the surrounding provinces, and his most trusted generals led his armies. What neither Nobunaga nor Yasuke could foresee was that Akechi Mitsuhide, ordered to lead reinforcements to Hideyoshi, had instead redirected his 13,000 men toward Kyoto in a meticulously planned coup. The first warning came not as battle horns, but as temple bells, ringing at an irregular hour. Contemporary accounts describe Yasuke bursting into Nobunaga's private chamber as smoke began seeping through the temple complex, urgently reporting the unthinkable. They were surrounded by an army flying Mitsuhide's banners. What followed unfolded with brutal swiftness. As Mitsuhide's forces overwhelmed the temple's outer defenses, Yasuke organized the woefully outnumbered guards into a defensive perimeter around Nobunaga's quarters. Witnesses later testified to the African warrior's extraordinary valor during these chaotic moments, wielding his oversized Nodachi sword with devastating effect, cutting down waves of attackers in the narrow temple corridors, where his size and strength created a momentary bottleneck against the overwhelming force. For precious minutes, Yasuke's desperate defense held, allowing Nobunaga crucial time to perform his final acts. Recognizing the inevitability of defeat, Japan's great unifier followed samurai tradition rather than face capture. While Yasuke fought to buy time, Nobunaga committed seppuku, ritual suicide, then ordered the temple set ablaze around him, denying Mitsuhide even the triumph of displaying his head. As flames engulfed the inner sanctuary, Yasuke, now fighting through fire as well as enemies, faced the bitter choice between death alongside his lord, or survival to avenge him. The chronicles disagree on how he escaped the inferno, but agree that he fought his way through Mitsuhide's encirclement with wounds that would have killed most warriors, eventually reaching the compound where Nobunaga's heir, Oda Nobunaga, was rallying survivors for a final stand against the betrayal that had shattered Japan's path to unification. Blood-soaked and half-blinded by smoke, Yasuke reached Nijo Palace by nightfall to find Oda Nobunaga, Nobunaga's eldest son and heir, marshalling what remained of loyal forces. The scene inside the compound veered between disciplined preparation and barely contained panic as couriers brought news of Mitsuhide's men securing Kyoto's strategic points. Surviving accounts from samurai present that night describe Yasuke's dramatic entrance. Armor charred, wounds hastily bandaged, bearing first-hand witness to Nobunaga's final moments. His detailed report of Honnō-ji's fall galvanized the defenders, transforming abstract loss into specific outrage. For Nobunaga, the African warrior represented a living link to his father's final orders and innovative spirit. Despite traditional samurai skepticism toward foreigners, not a single voice questioned Yasuke's inclusion in the war council that followed. The man who had begun life as a slave now helped shape the response to a crisis that would determine Japan's future. Dawn on June 2nd revealed the cruel mathematics of their situation. Nobunaga commanded barely 500 loyal warriors against Mitsuhide's thousands. Contemporary chronicles recorded the final exchange between Nobunaga and Yasuke as they prepared for the inevitable assault when the young heir asked if Western tactics might offer some advantage against overwhelming odds. Yasuke reportedly shook his head and replied, "Today we fight as samurai." The battle that followed unfolded with brutal efficiency. Mitsuhide's forces breached the outer walls within hours despite fierce resistance. As the perimeter collapsed, Yasuke led a desperate counterattack that temporarily stalled the advance, his distinctive fighting style and imposing presence creating momentary confusion in enemy ranks. But tactical brilliance could not overcome raw numbers. By midday, Mitsuhide's troops had penetrated the inner compound. Surrounded and grievously wounded, Yasuke continued fighting until physically overwhelmed, not surrendering, but simply collapsing from blood loss and exhaustion after cutting down 13 of Mitsuhide's samurai. As consciousness faded, the last sight his eyes registered was Nobunaga performing ritual suicide rather than face capture. A final act of defiance that completed the destruction of the Oda line and left Yasuke, the African outsider who had risen to unprecedented heights in Japanese society, at the mercy of the very tradition he had come to embody. When Yasuke regained consciousness, he found himself not facing execution, but kneeling before Akechi Mitsuhide himself in an unprecedented war council. Contemporary accounts from Mitsuhide's own scribes reveal the usurper's fascinating dilemma. What to do with this African warrior who had integrated so completely into Japanese society, yet remained fundamentally outside it? In a culture where ritual suicide was the expected end for defeated samurai, Yasuke's foreign origins created an unusual philosophical quandary. After examining the grievously wounded prisoner, Mitsuhide reportedly declared, "This black man is not Japanese, but a creature from another realm, therefore not subject to Japanese law." With this pronouncement, simultaneously acknowledging Yasuke's extraordinary status while denying him the dignity of a samurai's death, Mitsuhide ordered him returned to the Jesuits at their mission in Kyoto rather than executed. This exile marked Yasuke's abrupt ejection from the samurai world he had entered so improbably. The Jesuit records of July 1582 contain only sparse mentions of his return, noting his extensive wounds and profound silence regarding events witnessed. Within weeks, however, Mitsuhide's triumph collapsed when Toyotomi Hideyoshi, racing back from the Western Front, crushed the usurper's forces at the Battle of Yamazaki, avenging Nobunaga and claiming succession. Here, historical certainty regarding Yasuke dissolves into competing narratives. One account suggests he joined Hideyoshi's forces anonymously, fighting at Yamazaki without recognition. Another claims he boarded a Portuguese vessel at Nagasaki, sailing from Macau to vanish into the bustling Asian port cities. Most intriguing is a third possibility, suggested by fragmentary records from northern Kyushu, which mention a black warrior monk who established a remote mountain temple where he trained local youth in swordsmanship until his death around 1590. Like many pivotal figures who appear briefly but brilliantly on history's stage, Yasuke's ultimate fate remains unrecorded. A final mystery surrounding the enslaved African who became, however briefly, a samurai of the highest order in the inner circle of Japan's most powerful warlord. In the centuries that followed Yasuke's disappearance from historical records, his extraordinary story rippled through Japanese culture in unexpected ways. During the Edo period, 1603–1867, ukiyo-e woodblock prints occasionally depicted a powerfully built black warrior among the legendary figures of the Sengoku era. Kabuki theater productions featured stylized depictions of the Kurombo samurai, whose loyalty to Nobunaga became symbolically intertwined with Japan's complex relationship with outsiders. What began as historical fact gradually absorbed elements of folklore. Some tales crediting Yasuke with supernatural strength, others suggesting his arrival had been prophesied in ancient texts. By the Meiji Restoration of 1868, as Japan reopened to Western influence after centuries of isolation, intellectual circles rediscovered contemporary accounts of Yasuke in Portuguese Jesuit records and Japanese chronicles, allowing historians to separate documented fact from accumulated legend. Today, Yasuke occupies a unique position in transnational history, a man whose extraordinary life journey illuminates the complexity of pre-modern globalization and challenges simplistic narratives about historical racial dynamics. His transformation from enslaved African to honored samurai represents not merely personal resilience, but embodies the unpredictable cultural exchanges that occasionally transcended the brutal hierarchies of 16th-century societies. The Black Samurai's legacy reminds us that history's most profound moments often occur at unexpected intersections, where individuals caught in global currents of power and commerce nonetheless carve paths that defy convention and expectation. As Japan and Africa forge new economic and diplomatic relationships in the 21st century, Yasuke's story resonates as both ancient history and surprisingly modern parable, a testament to human complexity that transcends the boundaries historians too readily impose on the past.